So, Beth, when you were 5, your sister, who was 9 years old, came down with the measles. Tell us about that, and why did she end up singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning"?
Well, in August of 1943, she came down with measles. All fall, she was what they used to call sickly. She every now and then she would have a low-grade temperature that mother couldn't send her to school because of that. So by the time Christmas came around, the low-grade temperature did not abate. It kept it there. It was, and so Dr. Dickey was our doctor, our family doctor at the time, and he would come. He had done everything that he could think of to do to try to get that temperature down and to stay down, and it wasn't high. It was just 100, very low grade. And right after Christmas, he decided that he'd done all he could do. And so he said, I think she ought to go to UVA to get some tests run. And so mother took her to UVA, and they kept her in order to run the tests, and they didn't find anything. She was at UVA for at least 3 weeks. They couldn't find anything. So Dr. Dickey was so he was so upset that they couldn't put the finger on what was wrong with it. And his 2 sons, who were twins, were at UVA Medical Center at the time. They were studying to be doctors.
Bring a chair from right there. Right here.
And hey, Starlet, how are you?
Oh, there's a chair right there.
Yeah. They were studying to be doctors, so he conferred with them. He said, help me here with this problem. And they said, have they run, what kind of tests have they run? And they said, the tests that they ran, hey!
Is that a seat back there? I can sit back here in the little cubby.
Is that a seat back there?
There's a seat right here.
Okay.
That's good, thank you.
How long did they keep the culture in the petri dish when they ran the culture? Well, they always just throw it out after 24 hours. And so the 2 boys said, hold it over for at least 36 to 48 hours. So they did, and they found out what the problem was. So Dr. Birdsong was the pediatrician at UVA at the time, and he called mother in, and he said, we finally found out what was wrong. And she said, what is it? And he said, she has bacterial endocarditis, which is a bacteria of the lining of the heart, which is a fatal disease. And we had 2 kinspeople the year before and a couple of years before that die of bacterial endocarditis. And so she knew what it was. She didn't have to ask. And so she looked at him and she said, okay, what do we do now? And she said, he put his feet flat on the floor and he said, do you realize what I'm telling you? That she has this disease, this fatal disease. And mother said, you're talking to me as a doctor. I'm talking to you as a mother. What do we do now? And he kind of sat back and relaxed a little bit, and he said, right here on my desk is the latest AMA magazine. And in it is an article about a new drug that they are testing that will fight, or they think will fight, bacteria. And she said, let's test it. He said, we don't have it here. She said, where can I get it? The only places that have it are the VA hospitals of the wounded that are coming back from the war, because they are experimenting on them. And there's one other place that is, and it's in Philadelphia Children's Hospital. And my mother was brought up and raised across the river from Philadelphia in South Jersey. And she said, I am taking my child home. So they made arrangements for the Philadelphia hospital to take her. And these experiments were given for people who had this only, they did not do it, they did not experiment on people who had already been cured with this drug. They just did it as an experimental drug on pneumonia, and if they were cured, then no more would get cured. It was a difficult medication to produce because it was from mold, and mold, how slowly mold develops. They had not, so it was very limited as to who they could give it to. So she happened to be the first patient in the United States that ever had this disease when this drug was becoming available in the experimental stage. So they went to Philadelphia and on the train, and she didn't weigh, by that time she weighed about 40 pounds. She was 10 years old, well, 9 years old. So the porter picked her up in his arms and put her on the train. And they took her, she was in the hospital in Philadelphia for about 3 weeks before they even started her on it, because they didn't know how, they didn't even know how to give it to her. They didn't know whether to give her shots daily or what, so they finally decided on drip. They'd have this drip, so they put a vein here and drip it, and that vein would collapse. She wasn't up at 40 pounds, so you can imagine how small her veins were. Hey, Jacob.
Hello.
And then they put it in this vein, and then that would collapse. So it was one of these things. It was hard to find a vein for it to drip into. But about 2 weeks after that, there was the doctor that attended her was the head of the cardiac, and his name was Dr. Stokes. And he would have this retinue of people coming behind him, like any learning hospital in UVA. The man of the department, and he had all these little medical students following him. And so finally, Mother asked him. She said, "Dr. Stokes, are you related to any? Do you know any Dr. Stokes that used to be family doctors in South Jersey about 30 years ago?" He said, "Yes, that was my father." So once they made that connection, then they started, she felt better that she had that connection to work with. She stayed with her sister while she was up there and rode the train into Philly every day. And so it was about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, about the last of February into March, that she had shown improvement, or the bacteria had kind of dissipated, had gone away. And so at the end of when they saw improvement and they saw that it was working, Dr. Stokes called Mother in his office, and he said, "I think we've got it." But he said, I don't want her to go very far, because he said we want to test her daily once she gets out, and then after that 2 or 3 times a week to make sure that that's not coming back. So that means that she had to move her to her sister's, and they had to stay there until another month at least. But when she heard that, she was heading toward my sister's room, and she opened the door to go into the room, and my sister was sitting in the bed singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." She said she closed the door, went down the hall, went into the bathroom, and collapsed on the floor. So, anybody know what the drug was? Penicillin. First one in the county, I think, that had ever been cured with penicillin of bacterial diseases. So, and she's doing fine.
So you lived in Tyro, and you're the daughter of Captain Billy Massey,
Mm-hmm.
who ran a store and a mill. Tell us about him and his store, his mill, and what about his early life before he settled down? How did he come to be called Captain Bill?
Well, the Captain Billy came the day he was born. His maternal grandfather, Sam Ford was his name, had just lost his wife the year before. And Sam Ford had 3 daughters, one in Clifton Forge, one in Lynchburg, and one in Tyro. And he would just trade back and forth. He would go see one until either they got tired of him or he got tired of them. And then he would just shuffle himself amongst his 3 daughters. Well, he had some sons too, but they were not as nurturing as the daughters were. They didn't cook as well, I don't get. So he happened to be a Tyro when my daddy was born. And while he was there, sometimes he would take the mail to up the mountain, the mail route. And so he had gone out on a mail route that morning, and when he came back, my daddy had been born, and it was when he went in to see his daughter, that he called her Cammie. Her name was Mary Campbell, and they called her Cammie. "What you got there, Cammie?" She said, "Well, I've got a fine boy." And he looked at him. "What you gonna name her, Cammie?" "Well, what you gonna name him, Cammie?" "Well, we've named him Williams Effinger." He said, "What are you gonna call him?" "Well, we're thinking about calling him Billy." "That's a mighty long name for a little boy." He said, "Billy sounds fine, but whatever you decide to name him, you got a fine little captain there." So Captain Billy became his name right there. It was always there. So Daddy was one of 7 children. Not the youngest, not the oldest, but he had 2 brothers, one older and one younger. And the 2 brothers knew exactly what buttons to push. My daddy had a temper as a child and easily could get into a fight. And my grandmother was just on pins and needles all the time. She knew that somebody was going to get hurt. So when he became later teen, 16, VES school in Lynchburg had just opened up. And she thought, that's a good place for him. So she sent him to VES. Well, he went there for about 2 years. And he had finished his 3rd year, but he didn't like school. He wasn't a good student, and he didn't like school. And the higher up he went in classes, the less he liked. When he completed his junior year, with grades still to be made up, he had a choice. He could either stay there and go to summer school and make those grades up, or he could go home and work on a farm. Neither one of those appealed to him what bit. He didn't want to do either one. And the way to go home was to go down on Jefferson Street in Lynchburg, catch a train, go to Arrington, and catch a mailman coming from Arrington up to Tyro. Well, he stood there on Jefferson Street waiting for the train to come to take him to Arrington. Didn't want to go home. Didn't want to go to school. What's he going to do? About that time, he was standing right next to the railroad track that this slow-moving freight train going west. It looked mighty enticing to him. He took a hold of it, swung himself up, and rode that train out of Lynchburg, out toward west. Well, he rode it until it got to Ohio. And as it slowed down to go to Cleveland, he hopped off in the middle of a field. Of course, he had his suitcase with him because he was going home. And he walked across the field to this farmhouse, knocked on the door, and a man answered who was about the same age as his own father. He was 56 years old. And do you have any work for me to do? And the man said, what kind of work are you looking for? He said, well, I was born on a farm, said I could do some farm work. He said, well, I'm not a farmer. He said, but I've got a neighbor down the road about a mile that he's a farmer. He'll probably have some. But come on in. And he said, my wife and I will give you something to eat. I know you're hungry. So his wife, Grace, gave him something. And then, of course, in the process of him being in there and talking to him, the man found out, Mr. Bowles was his name, Thomas Bowles, found out where Daddy was from, and I don't know how much he told him about he was running away from home, but he told him where he was from, who his father was, and so forth. And I don't know whether he told him, my parents had no idea where I am. They were expecting me home. So they nourished him. They gave him something to eat, and so he went down a mile down the road to the farmer, and the farmer said, "Yeah, I've got a job for you." And he said, "Okay." He said, "What is it?" He said, "I got a nice potato patch out there that needs digging up." Well, that was what he would have been doing had he gone back home. But this time he was getting paid for it. And so Mr. Bowles had told him, he said, if I don't know the man's name that he worked for, if he can't accommodate you, he said, you come on back and you stay with us at night, and then you work for him during the day. So that's the way it went. And as soon as he left to go to the farmer's house, Mr. Bowles wrote to my grandmother and grandfather, told them that we have your son and he's all right, and
He's making money.
we'll see. But otherwise, they would have no idea where he was. And they had just lost 3 years before that. Their oldest son in World War I had gotten killed. So here was another son that didn't know whether they'd lost him or not. But anyway, fortunately, he went to he went to someone's house who was going to take care of him. But at the end of the summer, he had enough money in his pocket then to buy a ticket back home. He didn't have to ride on the outside of the train to go home. But he didn't want to go home. He didn't want to go back to school. He was in the same dilemma then that he was when he started out. So his sister lived in Clarendon, which is a part of Arlington. It's I don't know whether they call it Clarendon now, but that's where it was. It was in Arlington. And she had a 1-year-old baby. And so he rides a train to Arlington, to D.C., knocks on her door. "Hey, you got a space for me?" She had to, of course, it was her brother. She had to take him in. She said, "What are you going to do up here?" "Well, I can find a job." He said, "I'd go to night school." Night school, yeah. And so, but anyway, letters went back and forth between my aunt, his sister, and their mother. "I've got Captain Billy up here. What am I going to do with him?" And so my grandmother would write back. Well, we're trying to see what we can offer him down here, what he can do down here. So it turned out he did get odd jobs. One of them was a loading dock to load up goods on trucks that were taking them in different places in the city. So my grandmother wrote to my aunt that the store, the grandfather did not know really. My grandfather did not work in the store. He owned it, but he didn't work in it. And he had other interests. The store wasn't an interest to him. So he would hire out people to work in the store for him. And so my grandmother told me, your father has turned the store over to me. She never set foot in the store in her life, but anyway. And we are desperate for have somebody to run it for us. So my father writes to her, "I might be interested in it. How much are you gonna pay me?" Anyway, he ended up running the store and the post office and the mill when he came home. That's where they put him. So that's where he stayed until he retired.
How about your mother?
My mother? Well, I came from a mixed family. Yankee and Southerner and rebel. So Yankee in those days were a dirty word because it hadn't been 100 years of the Civil War. And my mother was the youngest of 4 children. And she was born and raised in Merchantville, New Jersey, which was South Jersey. And when she graduated from high school, she didn't have any particular interest, no boyfriend, no particular interest. So her mother knew that she loved to roller skate. Then she loved to do that. She knew she liked sports, so she said, why don't you go to Temple now? Temple University today is a four-year college, but in those days it was like a community college. It was only 2 years, and you get a certificate just like you would at a community center. So she went to Temple and got a certificate to teach athletics, women's athletics. Well, while she was there, or just about her last year there, second year there, her mother died. And the estate, the house and so forth, was sold. She couldn't afford to keep it up. Her older siblings, all 3 of them, had married, and had families of their own and places to stay. So she applied at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania to work at in the athletic department, in the women's athletic department. So when she got there, she didn't have any money to go to college, to pay for college. So the president said, why don't you see if you can live with one of the professors on campus? And your salary, if you want to go to college, your salary will be your tuition. So they traded one for the other. And when her mother died, she had some stock in a foundry that her father was president of at one time. When her father died when she was 9 years old. So, but he and his brother owned a foundry, so they had stock in the foundry. So a little bit of that stock was all she had to live on while she was going to college. So when she graduated from Swarthmore, the year she graduated from Swarthmore, the head of the department of the women's athletic department retired. She slipped into that job. So she was head of the women's athletics at Swarthmore College. That's where she was when my daddy met her.
So how did they meet?
Okay. Daddy's first cousin from Lynchburg, Flo Dupuis, worked in Chester, Pennsylvania. She taught school. And in those days, single teachers, a lot of them, worked as counselors in various summer camps. And summer camps usually, lasted the whole summer, from June until August. So she and my mother ended up at the same summer camp. And at the end of camp, my mother had a Model A Ford. And at the end of the summer, Flo wanted to come back to see her family before school started. And she didn't have any transportation. And she knew Mother did, and she knew Mother was footloose and fancy free because she didn't have any family to go back home to. So she said, how would you like to go to Virginia? I said, okay. So she said, well, if you take me down to Lynchburg to my family, she said, I'll show you around Virginia. So Mother just brought her down here. And while they were in Lynchburg, Flo's mother, Aunt Kate, said, why don't you take Betty, they called her Betty, why don't you take Betty down to Tyro to see Aunt Cammy? Okay. So they went down. Now, my sister tells us a little bit different. She said it was Thanksgiving. I say it was the end of summer, but I'll stick with my story. They went out to Tyro from Lynchburg. And in those days, I think you had to, between Tyro and Massey's Mill, I think you had to ford the river twice. And then, of course, there's several places that there were no bridges, that you just had to go across the river. And this was in end of the summer. So they went out, and while they were out there, a freshet came out. Now, you know what a freshet is? A freshet is a hard rain. And the creeks and the rivers rose up. And they couldn't go across them. They couldn't ford them. So they decided, okay, we're just going to have to spend the night until all of this settles down, and then we'll go back to Lynchburg. Well, the people in Lynchburg were expecting them to come back that night. So they had to let them know, and somehow how they were going to not be home that night. And Tyro, they didn't have a phone at Tyro. The only phone that they had was Uncle Bland's at Tyro, Bland, where Bill Flippin lives now. That was the only phone that was in the area. So then they had to go out to Uncle Bland's, a mile down the road, to use the phone to call Lynchburg. And Mother was the one with the vehicle. And she said, but I don't know where that is. Daddy said, I'll take you. So he rode with her back to Uncle Bland's, and on the way back, he looked at her and he says, I'm going to marry you one day. Well, Mother never heard, she knew the word flirt in the dictionary, but she had never, ever encountered anything such like that before. So she just, she was just enamored, she just took it all in. So that's where it all blossomed and started. She thinking he was serious and he was just flirting around, But
So, you went to school at Fleetwood, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, first grade, 1944 was my first year in first grade. And Fleetwood, I don't know, all of those schools, Fleetwood, Rockfish, and Livingston were all built in the early 30s from the WPA program. I mean, we called it the alphabet soup of Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. And it was given, the government helped to build these schools. And they were all basically the same, not exactly the same architecture, but basically. And when Fleetwood was built, if you've ever been up that way, they know that when they go up the road, they see the back side of Fleetwood. Well, when Fleetwood was built, it fronted the road, which ran right next to the river. And 2 or 3 years later, the road was rebuilt behind the church, behind the school, instead of in front of it. So that's why you see the back of it today, because it wasn't built to be that way. But the back of the school, when you go in that way, you're going into the first grade. First grade here, first grade here. Then you go second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then the front of the school had the high school. When you came out the front door, you graduated.
How did you meet J.W.?
I met him when he came up for a prom date with my sister. Well, that's the first time I ever laid eyes on him. His first cousin, Neil Henderson, had been dating her, and he had graduated from high school. And he had asked her to the senior prom. And 2 or 3 days before the senior prom, he had gotten recruited or gotten orders to go, I think he was in the Navy, to go to a certain boot camp. And he had to be there on that Friday before the Saturday night dance. So that left my sister without a date. And it was, up to him because he was the one that was not able to come. So he called his first cousin, J.W. Their mother and father were brother and sister. Uncle Elmo Henderson and Mama Goodwin were brother and sister. And he knew J.W. didn't have a date, so he says, "Hey, how about fill it in for me?" Going up and just taking her to the prom. And J.W. had graduated by that time, too. So that's the first time I ever saw him. I was sitting on the steps at the house when he came in the door to pick up my sister. And they really didn't date. I mean, that was the only time that they connected. But then the community center was built. And that was at Quonset Hut that was in Livingston. And they had, they built it for a community dance place. And that was quite a social place. Grandmothers even came. Whole families came. I mean, it was a good time. And all of it was big band stuff, Jimmy Dorsey and all of that stuff. And it was fun. It was really a fun time. And so the boys got onto the fact that they didn't really have to take a girl, and because they had to pay for her, they could go and pick up a girl once they got there. So we, and I went with a couple a girl and her husband who she worked for Daddy in the store, so I had gone with them, and I was one of the pickups. He asked me if he could take me home. So I asked Martin, I said, how about it? Well, because he had dated my sister, I knew he was okay with the family. And so he took me home that night. I was 15. And he was 15 and 6 or what, 21? And it was, then that was like in February, and then the following May was my junior prom, and I asked him, the next time I dated, I asked him to take me to the junior prom, and he did. And I can't say it was because it was a full year after that we started dating on a regular, but that's how we finally got together. And I was 15, and I don't think I ever dated anybody else.
And you're sticking to that.
So you graduated from Fleetwood?
When I was 17, we had 11 grades. We didn't have an 8th grade. We had through 7, and then we had 4 years of high school.
And did you get the job with First National Bank right after that?
No. My mother insisted that both of us be educated. And I was like my daddy. I didn't like school. I didn't want to go to school. So by that time, I was very much involved with dating and going with JW. And she had insisted, she knew my lack of preparedness to go to college. So she insisted that I go to 1 year of the new school, 1955 Nelson County High School, to get like physics and stuff that was not offered at Fleetwood, to prepare me to go into college. So I did have that extra year, and so I was 18 then when I finished that. And I did go to William and Mary 1 year for me, for the sole purpose of showing my mother that I was not college material. And she found out by the end of the year that I was not college material. So she relented and allowed me to become engaged by that time. And so of course, we were looking around for a job. Daddy was looking around for a job for me. And he was on the board of the it was the First National Bank of Nelson County at that time. And so he called the president, Mr. Roberts, and asked him if they had an opening. And it just happened to be that one of the girls had become pregnant that summer and decided that she couldn't work anymore. So I stepped into her job. And that was in 1957 when I walked through the doors of the First National Bank of Nelson County. And when I walked out, it was 1998. So I was there 40 years or whatever. But when I first went into that bank, everything was done by hand. Everything was done by hand. And we had we had two windows, regular windows, and then we had a high window that the mortgages and all of that was paid. But everything had to be done by hand. And we had a book, we had a ledger by the window. And the left hand were the money taken in, the right hand was the money taken out. And everybody worked out of the same drawer. Everybody worked out of the same ledger. If we were out of balance at the end of the day, we really didn't know who it was that made that mistake. But usually we found it. But it was we closed the bank at 2:00. That's what you said, banker's hours. We closed the bank at 2:00 because we had a lot of work to do after 2:00 because everything was done by hand. So that was a learning experience.
You told me you also balanced people's checkbooks.
Oh yeah, someone would come in and just fuss at us and I don't know why I overdrew that check. I had such and such a money in that bank. I said, bring me your a checkbook and bring me your bank statement, and in the morning I'll tell you why you did it. And I would take it home that night and work on it, find out that they did not put down a check or that they put down a deposit twice or something. I always found it and showed it to them the next morning. Oh yeah, well I guess you were right. Yeah. So I did that. And a lot of times, sometimes they would call me at home, some of my neighbors between Tyro and Livingston. I've got a deposit to make, but I don't have time to come to the bank. If I put mine in the mailbox, could you pick it up and take it to the bank for me? Yeah, okay, so I do that too. So you see, the banks have stopped being customer banks now. They're all business, and I just, it bothers me.
Self-service.
Yeah, it was.
Ask her how she counts money and rolls coins.
Roll score. Oh, we used to have those flat rollers, quarters of we had flat rollers and we take the money and we just roll them up. And when the coins came from Brinks would bring us, they bring us loose in the bags, loose coins, and we would have to sit and roll those coins and put them in their little in the little trays. But they didn't come rolled. They all came loose, and we had to sit there and roll them up in those flat rollers. And so that was fun.
Too fast.
So tell us about falling off the bridge.
Well, this was the summer after my sister came home from the hospital. When she finally came home from the hospital after Memorial Day in May, the first week in June. My birthday was May, in the middle of May. So Mother wanted to see, she hadn't seen me, hadn't been with me all that year, from January on. So she wanted me to come up there to be with them during my birthday. So I rode up. Daddy rode me up to D.C. Met mother. She came from New Jersey to D.C. Daddy took me this far, and then I changed, and mother took me back there. So I was in with her until we came back home the week after Memorial Day, and I got a cinder in my eye. That was the steam engine time, but this was in August after we had come home. Betty Ann Saunders, she's a Walker now, Betty Ann Walker, and T.I. Withers, her first cousin, both of those girls were older than my sister. My sister's 4 years older than I am. They were at least 2 or 3 years older than she. I was the baby tag-along. I was the tag-along. Sometimes that they didn't want, but anyway. It was 1944, and one of the things that the country that we were doing for the cause of our country was collecting iron and scrap iron, anything that floated down the river that we could use as scrap iron and turn in. So somebody had in some way had gotten, I don't know, it was part of a wheel or something that was underneath the bridge. And this bridge went across the Tyro River right there behind Fitzgerald's, right there behind the tea room Fitzgerald's. It's on Carter Hill Road. And the bridge was a trestle, just like the one at Oak Ridge. It had a trestle on the top. There were several of them, one in Massa's Mill, one at Tyro, several of those trestle bridges. And there was an iron bar that went from the top down onto the floor of the bridge. And so my sister had seen this piece of iron underneath the bridge, so she decided she was going down, she and Betty Ann were going down there and see if they could dig it out from rocks and get it. Well, Tia and I stayed up on the bridge, and I held on. Now, that thing was bigger than that, but my 6-year-old hand held on to that round bar, and I tiptoed out on the edge of the bridge, and I looked to see what I could find. Looked and see, and first thing you know, I was gone. I mean, I just didn't have anything under my feet at all. And down I went, and here it was in August, and it was a low point of the water. And I splashed down between two concrete pillars. And when I came up, I couldn't get up because the rocks were slick. I could stand up. If I could have stood up, I would have been fine. But I couldn't stand up because the rocks were slick. I couldn't get a grip enough to stand upright. So I just kept bobbing. Well, Betty Ann was just on the edge of the water, and Barbara Ann, my sister, was between her, and she had stepped out into the water a little bit, and they formed a chain, holding on like this. And she reached up and grabbed me by the back of my dress. I had a red dress on with pretty little smocking on it. I can remember that now. She pulled me by the scruff of that thing and pulled me up so I could stand up. And then on the way home, she told me to take my shoes off because it was squishing. And then when I got home, Mother she could not believe that and we had a maid, a help, a colored woman come every Saturday. And Gracie was her name. Gracie was there. And Mother said, Gracie, you take her into the bathroom and you put her in the tub and you see if anything's wrong. She said, my knees are just too weak. I just cannot do it. And so that was because you see that water was where the people would empty the sewage in the little creeks and they would flow into that water. I I was red as a beet when I got out of there from all that scrubbing that she was doing. But then later on, Mother got enough nerve to say, well, take me and show me exactly where she fell, because she still couldn't believe it, I had fallen. But that's when I fell off the bridge.
How far down did you fall?
But it was about 10 feet. It was about a 10-foot fall. It just fell right on. It's just in the
What
perfect
age was
place.
this? What age were you?
I was 6.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I was 6.
Tell us about the camping trips that your family would take.
Daddy, that was one of the family things that we'd love to do together, was go camping in the mountains. And it was something cheap and it was something convenient. Daddy would work into the store until dark, 7 or 8 o'clock at night, because Saturdays was the busiest time. That's when everybody came to do the shopping. And so Mother would pack up the car. We had stuff ready to pack. And we didn't have a tent. We just had we had 2 army cots that were left over for her camping days when they used to camp before she was married. 2 army cots. Daddy had his roll mattress, bedroll, and I slept in the car because I was asthmatic and I could stretch out very easily on the back seat of the car. So, and then we would go up in the mountains. It would be dark when we got up there, and we'd just go in various places. Sometimes the parkway was under construction. They had just started building the parkway, and there were lots of places up there that we could pull off and camp, because there wasn't any traffic up there. Nobody was allowed up there. It's far. So, and then we go up to Crabtree Meadows, and we go behind the fish hatchery. We had several spots that we would go camping. But when we got there, we had to put our bedrolls and cots and stuff out in the dark, because we got there after it went in the dark. So, but that was one of the things that we did. And Daddy, sometimes he loved it so much that he would go by himself without the family. But he wouldn't go by himself. He always had to take somebody to cook for him and keep the fires going for him. So one evening, he took this local colored man that we had up there. His name was Bill D. But Daddy called him Foots for some reason. I don't know why. And he liked to. He was an alcoholic. He liked to drink. And Daddy had, when he went up camping like that, we had a 1940 Ford. And when you put the seat to get in the back seat, you put the front seat forward. And in the middle between the passenger seat and the driver's seat was a hole that the mechanism of the thing would go back into. And that's where Daddy would put his little pint of liquor to relax when he went up camping. So he had to stop on the way between Tyro and up on the mountain to talk to somebody. And of course Foots was sitting in the passenger seat. So when he got back in the car, he opened the car and this smell of this pure liquor just hit him in the face. Daddy reached over and he pulled that thing out, but that much was gone. Foots, this thing was full when I started at the house. He said, I wonder what happened to it. Foots said, Lord God, Mr. Man, I said, I don't know, must have evaporated. Yes, it evaporated all right.
Tell us about what happened during Camille. You were here in Lawrence.
I was across the way here. We lived where Jay lives now. And we knew there was a terrible storm because it came in around the window frames. We never had rain to do that before. And when it came in around the window frames, of course, I was the next morning just wiping up stuff. And JW, who was Commissioner of Revenue in the county, he had dressed to go to work. And he had a Bronco, four-wheel drive. And he got in the Bronco to go to work, and he got down here at Rucker's Run between here and the bridge, and between here and the school, and there wasn't any road. The road was just a chasm. So he turned around and came back. He said, "Wow, that must have been a powerful thing." He said, "Something's not right here." So about that time, Raw Satterwhite comes bouncing in with his Jeep, and he said, "You going to work, fella?" He said, "Not tonight, not today." He said, "I can't get there." He said, "Well, come on, drive around with me and we'll see where we can go." So the only place that we could get to was Arrington. We could go to Arrington. So then we came back and stayed at our house just until about this time it was around noon. And we started, they started hearing stories about things happening at Tyro and Massie's Mill and so forth. The Statons were no longer there, and the Rainses had been washed away. Well, the Statons and the Olivers had lost their home and family. And the Statons lived a mile above my parents, and the Olivers lived a mile above that. And we had no idea what happened to the rest of the people that as you come on down the river. And they were reluctant. They were whispering around. They were reluctant to say anything to me about it. But finally, they let I was in on what was happening. So from that point until midnight, almost midnight, I didn't know whether my parents were living or dead, or where they were, or what was the situation. And that night, Arthur Wilson's two teenage boys had been recruited, or they had volunteered, to go into helicopters to show the drivers of the helicopters the lay of the land, and where, if they said go to Lowesville, they could tell them which way Lowesville was, go to Massie's Mill and so forth. So they had been and this was more for rescue than it was for evacuation. But it turned out to be evacuation, because by that time everybody who had to be rescued had been taken out of the trees or whatever. But it turned out to be evacuation. So anyway, they knocked at my door and told me, they said that my mother and father were fine. The house was still there, but he said my aunt and her husband and his 3 grandchildren and the lady that lived in the house with them had all been evacuated. They just took off and went to Charlottesville, because they lived in Northern Virginia, so they went to Charlottesville, and then the Northern Virginia people picked them up and took them home. So when we got up there, the next day we were determined to get up there. When we got up there, we found out that the river had jumped its course right there in front of the package shed. It has jumped its course, gone through the field, around the back of our house, and it came through the yard, or right through, almost through the house of my grandmother's house, and then across the road and back into the river. And if the Corps of Engineers had not rerouted it back to its original bed, that's where it would be today. So we had to cross the river between the store and the house to get to the house. And there was this great big machine highway machine that was trying to get all of this situated. We rode that across. But we decided to come back behind the house the other way, not the roadway, but the field, through the field. And we came back that way.
Yeah, I knew that was coming.
Betsy was, 7?
Yeah.
Jay was 3, 4. JW had Jay in his arms. I had Betsy by her hand. She had flip-flops on. When she got in the middle of this, it wasn't any higher hardly than your ankles. It wasn't really high, but it was swift coming down. She got in the middle and she lifted her foot up and the water just took her flip-flop off and the flip-flop went this way. Well, that's when the hysterics started. Oh my gosh. We had to trade children. Because I couldn't.
I was determined to get that flip flop.
She had to he had to pick her up bodily and carry her. I had to take Jay, and we got across there. But I had taken some food to them. Fortunately, there were neighbors who were not affected as much, and they brought food to the people in the community who had been affected. But that was my experience of being up at Tyro, and the water had come just up to it had covered the floor in the house, but it had not come up into the house. And that didn't say anything. The other one, my grandmother's house, the water came through it and knocked off a piece of it.
So tell us a little bit more about your daddy's store.
Oh, well, Daddy, the original store was built in about 1893. It's still standing right there next to the other store. And for two generations, it was run by my great grandfather built it. Hal had it built, and then my grandfather, as I say, didn't actively work in it because he had other. He was by trade or by not by. He was educated to be a bookkeeper, and he liked to keep books, so he that's what he did. But wasn't really interested in working in the store. He kept the books and everything, but he wasn't interested in actually being there doing the job. So they would, I would say, rent it out, but pay somebody to work in there for them. And then when Daddy came back in 1922 and took over, that's when it really started with the family working in it. And in 1940, he built his own store because by that time, see, the post office was in my grandfather's name. When he died, it was shifted to my grandmother's name, although she never set foot in it. She was the postmaster because that's the only money she had. There was no Social Security. But because it was put in her name, she started then getting Social Security. And once, when she was 70 years old, she had enough quarters to shift the post office over to Daddy. And then that's when he built, in 1940, when he built his new new store. And I was 2 years old when that was built, when the new store was built.
Yeah, country stores generally have a reputation for being gathering places, but your father's place.
The first big word I ever learned was loitering. No loitering. That was a sign he had. He just didn't want people hanging around. Because, they would spit tobacco and they, have a little jug, and he just didn't want any of that going on around the post office and his and the customers, they knew this. And that is the reason I've heard them say, that's the reason that the colored children said that their parents were okay with them going to Mr. Massie's store, because they knew there wasn't anybody going to be around to hurt them or tease them or whatever, that they could go there freely and safely. Let me tell you one story about the bridge. We used to play at the bridge. That was our place to play. We used to play poo sticks. Poo sticks. You gather, each of you have a stick in your hand, whether it's a twig or what, and you go to the end of the side of the bridge, facing the water coming down, and you all of them throw your sticks in at the same time, and then you rush across to the other side, see who comes out first. And that was poo sticks. But another thing we played was Billy Go Gruff. And there was Betty Ann and my sister Barbara Ann and me playing Billy Go Gruff. And my sister on this particular time was the troll underneath the bridge. Betty Ann and I were on this side of the bridge. I tripped across the bridge, and my sister says, "Who's that going across my bridge?" And I said, "It's me, just little Billy goat girl, just going over to eat some grass. I'm going to come and eat you up." "No, please don't do that. My mother's coming. She's a whole lot bigger than I am. And you just wait for her. She'll be along in a minute." And so here's Betty Ann and here's me. I've already gone across. Well, here comes the little neighborhood boy. Not knowing what's going on. He lived here. The bridge was here, and he lived down this little lane. He comes, and she looks at me, and I look at her, and we didn't want to disturb the game. So here he comes across. From underneath the bridge comes, "Who's that going across my bridge?" Well, his pace hastens a little bit, and he hollers back, "It's just as much my bridge as it is yours." And we just go into hysterics. And she comes up there, "Who was that?" She had no idea what had happened. She was quite innocent of the whole thing. But that's the kind of things we like to play.
You're a good storyteller.
Why don't you tell the story of the three wives?
The three who?
The three wives from our ancestors.
Oh gosh, that's, well, Grandpa Billy, the one who built Pharsalia, had he had 4 wives.
I'm just guilty.
The first one lived about 5 or 6 years. She had one child. She was kind of sickly, so she died on him after about 5 or 6 years. The second one, and she was from the Bedford area, so the second one he went back to that same area and courted again, and had this one died in childbirth. In a couple of years after that, or the next year, but she had 2 children. She had a little girl, and then she died when she was giving birth to the little boy, who had also died. But not before she made him promise that he would go back to where she lived, and ask her best friend to marry him because she knew that she would take care of her children. She died before her baby died, so she thought she was leaving 2 children behind. So she wanted to know that her best friend was going to be taking care of those 2. So he did. It was very convenient. He just went back and he went back and married her in May. In October, she died of a kidney disease. So that left him with 3 wives gone and 2 children to take care of. So then he said, "Screw the Bedford area, I'm going over to the mountain where the women are hardier over there." So he was settling his father's estate, and he went over to Waynesboro area. Well, it was actually
Lexington.
no, it was Harrisonburg area.
Oh.
And he courted a woman who was the same age as his oldest son. But anyway, she had never been out of the valley, or not this way anyway. So she was 20 years old. He was almost 40. And the only way to get from the valley to the Piedmont is going over the mountain. And it was not, of course it wasn't paved. And it was no wider than a buggy, hardly. And it had deep ravines, if anybody's ever gone. Well, it's almost like Camel's Mountain, if you've ever been on Camel's Mountain, without it being paved. And so he was bringing her back home to Pharsalia. And she was in the buggy, and she was looking this way, and the horse would kind of falter, and it would bring the buggy this way, and she was looking. So one day, one time was too much for her, so she just absolute, well, I think she had a corset, maybe it was a little tight on her too. But anyway, she fainted dead away. And he said, oh my God, I have killed another one. But she outlived him. And I'm the result of it. One of the results. And so is Betty Sue.
Any other topics you'd like to hear about? Well, thank you, Beth.
Oh, good job.